Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. What's new and exciting in your... It has to be both. It's like the cruel and unusual punishment clause, right? It has to be both cruel and unusual to count. So what's new and exciting in your world this week?
This is new and exciting, at least exciting from the perspective of an economist. I've been watching the business about sanctions against Russia. It got me thinking about the relationship between economics and war. The data is very clear here. Countries that engage in more trade tend to behave more peaceably toward each other. And that makes sense if you think about it, because war disrupts trade, it destroys businesses, and this is contrary to the misconception that war is somehow a stimulus. War isn't a stimulus. Granted, an economy may jump into high gear during wartime, but all you're doing is shifting future spending to the present as we borrow to pay for this nonsense. But in terms of actual businesses that are not involved in producing things the military needs, war is a horrible thing. More than that, the more two countries trade with each other, the more the people in the two countries get to know each other. And it becomes very hard for governments to convince the people that those other people over there are somehow the enemy, because you deal with them on a day-to-day basis. So we have this phenomenon that countries that engage in more trade tend to behave more peaceably. But in times of conflict, the modern thing is for governments to turn to economic sanctions as a sort of non-violent way of hitting back at aggressors. There have been quite a number of studies done on economic sanctions, and it's unclear whether they work. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It depends whether, for example, other countries are also imposing those same sanctions. If they aren't, the sanctions don't mean that much because the country you're sanctioning can get the products it needs just through other means. It also matters, what are you prohibiting? Are you prohibiting the import and export of luxury goods? That's not going to have much of an effect. Are you prohibiting the trade in necessities like medical goods, food, and energy? That can have a significant effect, but the effect also imposes tremendous hardship on the citizens of the country. So we're kind of left with this question of what, if anything, would work from an economic perspective. A friend of mine suggested something recently that struck me as fascinating. This person said, what would happen if, for example, the United States offered some amount of money, let's say $36,000, and I picked that number because $36,000 is approximately the annual pay of a Russian soldier. What if the United States offered $36,000 plus citizenship for any Russian soldier who defects? Now, there are 150,000 Russian soldiers currently in Ukraine. Multiply at $36,000 each, that's $5.4 billion, which, of course, is a tremendous amount of money. But put it in perspective. That's less than what 1 week of the Afghanistan-Iraq wars cost us. So in terms of spending, it's a tremendous deal. And what would something like that economic incentive do? Even if not many soldiers took up the offer, all of a sudden, it would cause the army to turn its attention inward out of fear of its soldiers now defecting in exchange for this bounty. And that alone would hobble their operations tremendously. I'm left with this thought that there are perhaps some very creative things one might do economically beyond the simple bludgeon of sanctions.
I don't think that your scheme would work.
Let's think it this way. Everybody has a price. If $36,000 isn't it, maybe 50, maybe 100, maybe 300.
There are practical concerns here that can never be met. You can't get them from there to here without incident. But I take a different approach. I want to think about how well sanctions work. The best example, I think, involves the following people: John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Bill Clinton, the other George Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden. That's the Cuban embargo for you.
Oh, sure. How well has that managed to work?
It worked so well that 12 American presidents have come and gone. I don't know what the right answer is either. I know what all the wrong answers look like, but I don't know what the right one looks like.
Yeah, and among the wrong answers is something that Pennsylvania is doing right now. The Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board just announced that it was pulling all Russian-sourced vodkas off of its shelves. As a matter of posturing, that's interesting, but it doesn't actually have any effect because that vodka's already paid for. Taking it off the shelves is not going to have any effect whatsoever on Russia.
And company after company has turned Russian people away from their services. Most recently, OnlyFans. And for those of you out there who know what OnlyFans is, you will not see your favorite Russian people on that service for a while. What you see now is posturing, yes, but a lot of groping too. People don't know what the right answer is. I wonder if Putin's going to live through this because, you start making nuclear war comments and your generals become quite horrified and they have access to you and weapons all the time. I'm going to make things just a little more upbeat here, although not necessarily for the people involved. I'm brought to think about our friend Chris Wilcox, a longtime listener who's a truck driver. And the day I met him in 3 dimensions, he said, well, I can't wait until self-driving trucks put me out of business, which is a little weird to say. And this headline today, self-driving trucks start to propel land rush near major cities. I thought that we would be a few years away from self-driving trucks, but the companies who will run those trucks are already looking for places to put terminals for their trucks to park. And you don't do that until it's almost time.
Right.
The land is exceedingly expensive. So what they're doing now, and they're looking, so say where I live, Tucson, they're looking as far away as they have to go while still getting a reasonably priced parcel of land. Because when there are no drivers, you've got some options. And all of a sudden, this idea that we're about to get self-driving trucks seems very, very real. It's going to have a number of effects, right? There'll be downward pressure on the prices of things you want to buy. And it may be the case that things get to market much faster. And I'm especially interested to see what it's like with something like produce, which in the United States we have to pick weeks ahead of time to get it into the store so it won't spoil before you buy it. Well, if we can cut a week or so off the transit, what happens now?
And certainly this is going to put some truckers out of jobs, but I don't know that everyone, like our friend Chris Wilcox, is necessarily going to be unemployed. Someone's going to have to be monitoring those driverless trucks. Perhaps one person can monitor 5 or 6 of them, but what may well happen is that people like Chris Wilcox, that is those who keep their jobs, find that they're actually worth far more because they're running multiple trucks, whereas before in person they could only run one.
It may be the case that people are legally required to sit in the cab and not drive the truck.
Yeah,
I wouldn't be the
so.
least bit surprised. Probably for the first year or two, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised to see that until people become comfortable with the technology. I was watching TV the other night and a car advertisement came on and it showed some guy parallel parking by not touching anything.
Yeah.
Both of my parents were involved in trucking. And you start to realize that there are going to be people put out here. There's no doubt. Bunch of people aren't going to have jobs anymore. In the aggregate, we're all better off. Case by case, they're worse off. But it's interesting, and the unintended consequence here is, of course, going to be the cost of near metro real estate. If these truck companies want to buy something 8 miles out of town everywhere, then that ring of 8 miles out of town, that's going to become very valuable real estate.
It's a beautiful market result. You know that this is coming because investors are putting their actual money on the table.
I wonder how far back self-driving cars will be. I'd kind of like a self-driving car, truth be told. I could sit in the passenger seat and get some work done for a change.
Now that I think about it, one thing that might come about from this is that trucks will be able to drive for longer periods of time. It may be the case that we end up in a situation where trucks drive only at night, which would free up the roadways for cars and people on their daily commutes.
There's a lot of possibilities here. Phoenix is about 2 hours away. Every now and then I see something typically on Facebook Marketplace that I really want to buy in Phoenix. I'm not driving 4 hours round trip to pick it up. But if I had a self-driving car, I could send it without me. I wonder if I could send it up to the grocery store and have the people just bring it out and put it in the car and it'll drive home.
You could send it out for an oil change.
There's really a bunch of stuff like this that I hadn't thought about until just now. From interesting to aggravating, we're recording this on the day before the State of the Union address. First, I predict that Joe Biden will not utter the word debt.
Nope.
During the address.
I'm with you 100%.
I predict that Democrats will stand up and cheer and Republicans will sit down and make faces every sentence or two. But there's something else that serves as the foolishness of the week. There are new CDC mask guidelines. It happens just in time for the State of the Union. Curiously. Now, nobody in the room, Joe Biden included, is going to have to wear a mask. Now, a bunch of them are going to do it for show, but none of them have to. And you start to think, well, if that's what it takes, at least we don't have to wear those masks anymore. Except here's the thing. You don't have to unless you want to get on a plane in an airport.
Yeah, if you want to sit with 600 other people in congressional chambers, that's fine. But if you want to sit with only 150 on a plane, that's another matter.
You'd walk in there and belch out your poison and kill everyone. I might say this because I have something close to 300 flights in the next 2 or 3 weeks, and I'm going to be aggravated on every single one of them. I ordered one of those masks that you talked about not too long ago. Let's just say those people don't seem to be all that concerned about getting it to me in a timely manner.
They've probably been inundated with orders.
I suspect that's right, but I also suspect that I'm going to be on all those planes with the hot breath that fogs up my glasses and irritates me in every way possible.
The mask James refers to, you can find at getunmasked.com.
Yeah, here we are providing those people free advertising.
That's right.
Week in and week out. We got to stop that. I did tell them that they should advertise with us. They haven't responded yet. Shocking, I know.
Well, if you dig through our show notes from several episodes back, you'll find a link for 20% off.
Yes, you will. I used that myself, and it worked just fine.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. If you'd like to support Words and Numbers, make your way over to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers, where you can contribute to our podcast-making habits. If you'd like to schedule us to come speak at your event, be it corporate or educational, or have James officiate at your wedding, send us an email at wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com. Lauren Heller joins us this week. Lauren is Associate Professor of Economics in the Campbell School of Business and Director of the Honors Program at Berry College outside of Atlanta. Her research interests include international health and development economics, as well as a wide variety of policy questions and topics in applied microeconomics. She has published scholarly articles in a wide range of outlets, including the Eastern Economic Journal, Contemporary Economic Policy, Defense and Peace Economics, the Journal of Developing Areas, and Social Science and Medicine. Lauren, welcome to Words and Numbers.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm going to be contributing very little to this episode because it's about sports. The best I can do is repeat some words I know, which is that Lauren does research into public funding of sports arenas, specifically answering a question that actually does interest me. Is this a good payoff? I mean, this is the argument we always hear from politicians that, well, if we spend taxpayer money on building this arena, it's going to attract businesses and jobs and people to the city and all of that, and it will all come back dressed up as more tax revenues for the city. Does it actually work that way?
Unfortunately not. I would love for it to in some ways. I hate being everybody's wet blanket. But when you crunch the actual numbers, not like these big inflated economic impact studies, we find that the typical economic payoff from an event like, let's say, the Super Bowl or something like that is maybe a tenth of what the projections normally say from mega events like this. Yeah. It's pretty abysmal, the difference between the economic impact studies and a more careful analysis.
In some sense, that doesn't surprise me because I've always thought intuitively, if there was such a big payoff, a payoff of the magnitude that politicians say, then why aren't private investors putting up the money?
Right. So these millionaire stadium owners, right, they need your help to make ends meet.
Right.
And the worst part about it is a lot of these sports stadiums are funded through public dollars. And to the extent, I mean, the worst way you can do this is sales tax. But in that case, then we literally, from a regressive tax, we are subsidizing millionaires on the backs of the poor. I'm really kind of surprised there's not a little more outrage over this, but I think it's because people like shiny big sports stadiums and teams and things like that.
And I do too. We all, except for weirdos like Anthony, enjoy watching sports and having top-end sports in our local markets. But here's where it gets a little strange, right? Because the Super Bowl is coming up tomorrow as we record this the night before the Super Bowl. And all you ever hear is exactly what you said a moment ago, that there's this massive benefit to the town that gets the Super Bowl. And it's a strange animal because the Super Bowl is held at a stadium regardless of which teams are still involved. The World Series, the NBA Finals, you're going to get home field advantages woven right into the nature of the thing. Not so Super Bowl. The towns with big stadiums line up to be included. I think the only thing worse is probably the Olympic city selection, which is just absurd when you think about that.
And people are finally catching on to the sort of scam that is hosting the Olympics. I remember distinctly when I was a kid and Atlanta got selected, everyone was talking about, oh, the great advantages of hosting the Olympics. And slowly, I think people have realized that hosting the Olympics should have nothing to do with economic benefit. Now, there's reasons a country like China, for example, might want to host an Olympic Games for sort of national pride or something like that. But I don't think the conversation anymore is that it has anything to do with economic benefit.
I'm just a semi-interested observer in Olympic things. It's always seemed a little odd to me. It was the authoritarian countries
Right.
that were pushing hardest to get the Olympics into their cities. I don't know why China would want this kind of scrutiny that they've invited into their midst.
Right.
It's a disaster for every country that hosts.
I actually felt really bad for Rio when they won the Olympics. I was like, oh gosh, you guys have like pretty big slums and stuff. Like, ooh, this is a bad look. Like maybe there's an opportunity cost to that spending.
I guess I'm going to ask you a psychological question, which is always a danger when you're talking to economists. But what the hell is wrong with these people?
I think a lot of it has to do with what we know about public choice and voter ignorance and things like that. But it has to do with how politicians get elected. If a politician is going to be the one that brought the Super Bowl to LA or the one that brought the Olympics, they get lots of accolades from this sort of scene effect of people coming. And for a new stadium, it's a big deal because people care a lot about their sports teams. I'm a Clevelander. I really still care about when the Browns left Cleveland.
As somebody who's not from Cleveland, I'm so sorry.
Thank you. But at the same time, a politician would get tons of accolades for bringing it. And they don't pay any of the unseen costs or the taxpayers subsidizing this. And honestly, NFL owners are holding cities hostage. If you don't build me a new stadium, essentially, I'll go and move to, say, Las Vegas or somewhere else. And so it's really too bad that it's the NFL owners that are colluding. And, well, they have a mechanism to do it, right? The NFL.
Right.
And not cities that are just, because if cities just banded together and said, nope, sorry, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and fund your own stadiums, we wouldn't have this problem. As Anthony said, I think it's not like they couldn't make ends meet by themselves. It's not like they're not earning plenty of profits off of NFL games and things like that.
That said, if I were an NFL owner, I'd pull the same crap.
Of course.
Oh, right.
They're following self-interest.
Sure.
One of the reasons I care so much about the Super Bowl, it's fun that we're having this conversation the day before the Super Bowl, is that the Super Bowl often uses a big carrot for these stadium subsidies. Like if you build a new stadium, particularly if it has a dome or something, like, let me tell you, we can probably get you a Super Bowl, and let me talk about the economic impact that's going to bring. And then they spend a significant amount of money to hire these economic impact sort of firms. They call them analytic firms and give them fancy names. Sometimes they slap on a university to give them another fancy name. Typically, the people that rate them aren't actually economists. It turns out you don't need a license to be called an economist.
Yeah.
They're not doing actual regression analytic work. And they use these things called implan, which is this sort of program where they just feed in numbers, feed out multipliers, and say, hey, before you know it, there's going to be a $475 million impact of hosting the Super Bowl in LA, which is about what the latest economic impact said for hosting the Super Bowl. And I can go into lots of reasons why those impact studies are way overvalued, but it's just kind of a crime.
Why is it, if they're so consistently overvalued, that people aren't waking up to this and realizing that the projections are nonsense?
In some ways, I do think people wish it were true. There's also very little follow-up on these studies, so they can give out these big numbers. Although I think reporters are getting wiser. I've had a lot more interest this year, for example, in my work than previous years. But there's a lot of big numbers that go out in press releases and stuff, and they never actually follow up to say, hey, did those economic impacts actually come to fruition, because they're off to the next city.
Right.
The big deal about why these things tend to be overvalued is the difference between gross and net visitors. So these economic impact studies account every new person to the Super Bowl as a brand new person. That would imply that all hotels would be at zero capacity and be completely empty were it not for the Super Bowl, that no one would do anything else with their time, that people would continue to go to LA, for example. No one would stay away in anticipation of Super Bowl crowds. And we know that's not the case. They also assume a lot of the money is spent locally, which may or may not be the case. So if, for example, hotels double rates in anticipation of the Super Bowl, it is unlikely that they're also going to double the rates of cleaning staff and front desk workers.
Right.
And so that doubling of rates, and therefore probably at least doubling of revenue, because they'll also have an increase in quantity, might materialize for hotel owners, shareholders, things like that. And that's fine. As economists, we're pretty agnostic about who the money goes to. But the issue is if it's the citizens of a particular city, LA, that are paying the revenues for this, they should at least know that they're not getting the full benefits. If you're dealing with the traffic congestion, if you're dealing with the increased traffic, if you're going to pay for the police and all the other costs associated with hosting these things, to the extent that you're not getting the same amount back is a real problem. Yeah, I think politicians like shiny objects that help get them elected. Also, they get some perks. It's no surprise when sports teams win national champions and stuff. It's the city politicians that get to mingle on the private jets and get to do all of that kind of stuff and have their names on the stadium.
And I would imagine as well, by the time enough time has passed that it becomes obvious that this stadium isn't generating what was promised, those politicians that approved it, they're gone. They've moved on to some higher office somewhere else.
Right. Often, or it's time for a new stadium at that point.
If we just build a bigger one, this time it'll work.
Right.
Well, from the perspective of a sports fan, there's something very special about going to a nice stadium.
Sure.
I remember the first time I went to Camden Yards to see the Orioles in that gorgeous park that they built. People were building new parks that harkened back to old style aesthetics, and it multiplied from there. And you go to Cleveland, you go to Washington, D.C. These are great baseball stadiums. As a fan, I love going to them. Now, as a fan, I never really hear that the taxpayers got fleeced on any of these projects. What we hear is, wow, isn't this new stadium in Pittsburgh something special? And it is. And here's the problem, because great things are made with this money. It just so happens that it doesn't add up for the people who spent the money.
Oh, right. I mean, yeah, new stadiums can be beautiful and wonderful. And I forget what it's called now because I forget who bought the naming rights. But I remember when the original Jacobs Field opened in Cleveland.
That's a hell of a ballpark.
Right. In place of the old municipal stadium. It was lovely to go to.
Yeah.
And it's a wonderful thing to do. You just have to realize you're being subsidized.
That's exactly right. And when you think about how much money is sucked out of the taxpayers, and it's a regressive tax, I don't know that you can make a moral case for any of these things, but you can make that self-interested case.
100% agree.
Ant wants to know why people don't catch on. Well, they don't catch on for the same reason they don't understand how the Electoral College works. There are just too many things to bother with. That's not their job. They just want to go to the game on Saturday. And as long as there's this differentiation of actual motivation from people to people, I don't know that you'll ever solve this problem.
It's classic concentrated benefits, dispersed costs.
It really is. And I just don't expect people to realize it.
Or even if they did, they paid so little relative to how much money Arthur Blank, the owner of the Falcons, gets. It might not be worth lobbying against that. But then, of course, stadium owners have every incentive to lobby for that.
Lauren, you said earlier about the rich subsidizing the poor, and James echoed that with the regressive tax business. And I've only been to a stadium a couple of times, but each time I was surprised that here's this huge edifice built at taxpayer expense, and I've got to pay a substantial sum to get in the door. And then once you're in the door, beer is $7 or whatever it is. And you stop to think about that and you realize, wait a minute, everybody's paying that tax, including the people who can't afford to come in the door and pay $7 for a beer.
Oh, absolutely. And to the extent that we fund, different stadiums are funded different ways, property taxes, sales taxes, all kinds of things. But to the extent that we use taxes that are fairly regressive, that means that not only are the poor paying for it just like the rich, the poor are paying a higher percentage of their income to do so than the people actually using the stadium. We have something very similar here in my local hometown of Rome, Georgia, where there is a tennis center that was funded by a special purpose local option sales tax, which is how you pass sales taxes to fund things in Georgia. And it turns out Georgia's sales tax is particularly regressive because we also tax food. Not all states do. What that means is we're essentially taxing the poor at a higher rate than we're taxing the wealthy to fund a tennis center. Who do we think's more likely to use a tennis center? Like, let's be real.
You can't even make the case that that's interesting to most people. Football is, basketball is, tennis not so much.
I think a lot about tennis in this town, but yes. And those $7 beers are probably more than that now. Gosh, probably $12 beers. When you walk into the stadium, it's not like the NFL owners are giving that money back. It's not like any of that's going back to the people that are paying the taxes. But you're right, there's only a certain percentage of the population that can actually do that.
While we're close to this topic, let me ask your opinion of this. Both James and I have noticed how strange it is that people lose their minds about multi-million-dollar salaries for CEOs.
Yes.
And yet, multi-million-dollar salaries for baseball, football players, nobody bats an eye. Somehow that's fine.
I think part of it is that they can sort of see a talent there that they can't see for a CEO. You can see LeBron dunk, and you can understand the athleticism and this unique talents that he has. An economist would say to command economic rents. But you might not be able to see those talents in a Fortune 500 CEO. One thing I think is particularly interesting about what you're talking about is the fact that they assume often for the CEO that it comes at the expense of the workers, like the entry-level workers in the firm. But you never see people talking about LeBron's salary and saying, what about the cleaning staff of the stadium? But that's a really interesting point, is we just don't view it in the same way, even though both might be able to command economic rents in that way.
As a sports fan, I'm constantly seeing other people say things like, well, LeBron physically gifted beyond all belief, but then he's able to put those gifts to work in a way that I find unimaginable. It's just amazing. But those same people would say, I could do the job Jeff Bezos does.
Yes, right. They do. Absolutely.
And that's every bit as asinine as saying, I could do the job that LeBron James does. If I could, I'd be doing it.
If you could, you'd be doing it. Yeah.
I want to get back to this stadium business because I find it so wonderful on the one hand and so offensive on the other. Are you aware of any locality that said, you know what, we're not playing this game?
Yeah, there's starting to be more pushback. I can think of places that pulled out of the Olympics because they've realized the deal. I think stadiums were a little slower. I have seen more pushback over time, and I'm hoping the more we can get word out about this and the more the public sort of realizes this, maybe we can overcome some of this, maybe rational ignorance, but still. I have seen in some cases a little more pushback in terms of not making the subsidies so egregious, right? Or asking for at least a little more cost sharing on the parts of the public. I've also seen emphasis on, well, multi-use facilities. Football stadiums are kind of the worst. At least baseball stadiums have a lot more games.
Right.
Or like an arena where you can do other things besides basketball or whatever. But in open air football stadium, there's very little you can do other than football or maybe soccer or something. There's been some movement toward, well, this isn't just a stadium. This is a multi-use facility. We're going to build retail outside and we're going to build housing and whatever. And you're going to see this whole revitalization. And I think in some ways that's a pushback to sort of recognize a little bit that these stadiums are not the good deal that you think they are. And often they're stuck in the middle of a city that sort of cuts off potentially otherwise homegrown organic economic activity that would go there. When we have this top-down stadium get plopped down in the middle, cut off commerce for local neighborhoods. So I think there's a little bit of recognition. I think the tide might be going the right way. The fact that you guys are asking to talk to me about this maybe means the tide's going the right way. But I haven't heard of particularly cities colluding and say, nope, sorry, we're not going to build your stadium, and calling the bluff and saying going to another city.
Right. Because
they're too scared to call that bluff. I mean, I get it. When I was in Cleveland, if a politician said, we can let the Browns go, yeah, that wouldn't have worked for any members of the city of Cleveland.
I'm trying to take this model and apply it to other things. For example, an airport, and ask the same question. Why can't the airlines pay for the airport? And I realize there's a significant difference there, which is the airport is used by multiple airlines. And if we asked, for example, United to build an airport, all of a sudden it's got some significant monopoly power in shutting out alternatives. But then when it comes to a stadium, we're granting the monopoly power. This stadium belongs to this particular team.
Absolutely. And, you see some of that monopoly power in an airport like Atlanta, for example. Delta has huge market power here. And there's a lot of love, I guess, from the city of Atlanta. Delta, please always stay here. Please don't go away, that kind of thing. But you're right. It pales into comparison to sort of team loyalties. I think that's part of it, too. I think of politics as sports teams. So I think there's that same tribal loyalty to a sports team where all of a sudden, if the team moves away, that's a bigger deal than just any potential economic loss. It's a part of who you are as a member of that city.
I'm born and raised in New England, and I can't begin to fathom the Patriots leaving, the Red Sox saying, well, Fenway's great, but we're going to go to Oakland. You just can't really fathom such a thing. And yet it's a realistic possibility.
Right. Particularly if you don't pay up.
Somebody comes up with a better offer. Well, it's in the owner's interest to think that through.
But it is interesting why cities, like the incentives behind why, I don't know, mayors or somebody doesn't collude and say, hey, if we all just agreed not to pay these subsidies, the poor millionaire sports team owners would just have to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and try to make ends meet.
But you know why that's never going to happen. Every politician knows not to trust any other politician.
That is probably true.
They're liars by definition. So when they say, okay, let's fix it so X doesn't happen, you can bet that they'll undercut you at the first turn.
You could think of game theory with this. It's a total prisoner's dilemma. You can say all the time, oh yeah, totally. We're not going to make this deal to bring a sports team to Las Vegas. It's just the most recent one that I can think of. And then all of a sudden, oh, never mind, we're actually going to do it. There's a ton of incentive to cheat on that deal.
So, Lauren, what's the hangover effect and how does that impact what we've just been talking about?
Usually after these big mega events, everybody looks at the economic impact of the events, but they don't look at the fact that people continue to stay away. If I know the Super Bowl is going to be in town or a political convention or some big event, I'm going to say, oh man, I'm not going to go into the city that day. It's going to be nuts. And that hangs on a few days after the event. So typically, if you look at daily hotel occupancy data and prices and revenue, sure, you'll see a big lead up for the event, but then you'll also see a hangover where actually that city does less well in the days following an event than they would that same time of year, same other economic conditions if the event wasn't there. I think that's why it's really important to sort of hone in. You can't just look at, for example, yearly data or something to like catch this out. You have to be pretty precise in these economic impact measurements or you'll miss these kind of things.
Lauren, thank you for joining us. This has been excellent.
Thank you.
That's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week when we talk about even better things than this time. Until then, you can follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. And I have to say, my goal last year, Ant, was to reach 100,000 Twitter followers. I only got 1,000 more last year, so I'm going to need 98,000 people. I don't know who's listening out there, but go tell probably 9, 10, 12 of your friends and you to get that party started. People can join us on Words and Numbers Backstage, where the conversation continues. And they can also...
What? What can they do?
And...
They can email us.
And so,
wordsandnumberspodcast at gmail.com.
I was hoping your dementia would have kicked in just enough that you had forgotten to say that. But life goes on. Be nice to each other. Give it a try. It'll be all right. And catch you next week.
See you next week, James.